In the spring of 1945, the world watched a city become a graveyard of hopes. The capital of a fallen empire was about to be consumed by the largest urban battle in European history. The human scale of that moment is almost unimaginable in modern comfort and distance. Inside Berlin, the air smelled of coal smoke and fear, and the population counted days instead of years. Families clung to what belongings they could carry, while officials whispered plans that would never reach the street level where survival mattered most. By April 1945, the Red Army had smashed through 3 years of German defenses with crushing momentum. Soviet formations moved like a tide across Eastern Europe, driven by years of suffering and a clear strategic goal to reach Berlin. Behind them ran a complex mixture of revenge, order, and political calculation from Moscow. For the German side, things fell apart in puzzle. Like fashion, piece by piece, as communication lines broke and armies drifted without clear orders. What remained of Germany's once formidable military establishment was now a landscape of improvisation, fear, and increasingly desperate commanders. Stalin's desire to capture Berlin had as much political meaning as military necessity. By that spring of 1945, reaching the German capital would be a symbolic triumph that guaranteed a place at the post-war table and erased decades of humiliation. Soviet commanders therefore prioritized speed and encirclement over cautious attrition as they approached German defenses. On the German side, Hitler refused to accept military reality, surrounded by men and layered falsehoods that insulated him from truth. This mismatch of intention and capability created a dangerous vacuum where orders were disconnected from the facts on the ground. Hitler's defense plans in 1945 read like the final acts of a tragic play, beautiful in rhetoric and empty in logistics. The Führer ordered new armies to assemble from scraps and civilians while expecting miracles of operational genius that did not exist. He promoted grand counterattacks and defensive rings in city sectors that were nothing more than symbolic gestures. Inside the bunker, the tone hardened into ritual and denial, with Hitler oscillating between fury and a resigned theatricality. Advisors, sanitized reports, and producers of bad news were replaced, which only deepened the gulf between policy proclamations and battlefield realities. As Soviet artillery opened on the city, the character of the battle changed from movement to grinding attrition. Whole neighborhoods became killing fields where each street offered a fight for a single block of buildings. Urban combat turned the city into a chessboard of ruin where snipers, tanks, and infantry engaged in brutal close-quarters fighting. Civilian populations were trapped between opposing violence and collapsing civil order, suffering from a lack of food, heat, and medicine, while being forced into basements and shelters. The human face of the conflict emerged in the daily grind of survival under constant bombardment and the eerie normality of desperate scavenging. The Volkssturm and other improvised German formations were emblematic of the last gasp of organized defense in Berlin. Teenagers, older men, and dislocated soldiers were thrown into battle with little training and less hope for success. Their presence revealed the moral and tactical bankruptcy of trying to defend a city with an exhausted and demoralized populace. These hastily assembled units did not win battles by themselves, but they altered the shape of fighting by turning each encounter into an unpredictable and humanly tragic affair. They slowed the Soviet advance in places and intensified the bloodletting in neighborhoods, where surrender would have been the more humane choice. Soviet tactics in Berlin combined overwhelming artillery with relentless infantry assaults that accepted massive casualties for the sake of strategic speed. The Red Army fought with a grim efficiency after years of total war experience, and commanders ordered the use of every available resource to break German resistance. Their operations were punctuated by moments of tactical improvisation and brutal clearing of fortified buildings. For Soviet soldiers, the battle was personal and political, fueled by memories of wartime atrocities and the urgency to end the European war. They moved from building to building with determination, but also with the hardened instincts of troops who had seen too much killing already. The Reichstag emerged as a symbolic focal point of the battle, as Soviet troops converged on its battered FACA. Capturing that building was more about narrative than pure military utility, because the Reichstag had become synonymous with German statehood. Both sides understood that who raised a flag there would influence how the war's ending would be remembered. The assault on the Reichstag was a chaotic, close-quarters fight full of hand-to-hand encounters and bitter resistance within shattered interiors. By the time the famous photograph of the Soviet banner appeared, the building had been transformed into a blood-soaked symbol of collapse and of conquest alike. While the Soviets fought through Berlin, Hitler withdrew further into a bunker world where theatrical final decisions replaced practical command. His last public addresses were filled with apocalyptic rhetoric and fantasies of miraculous counteroffensives that would never materialize. In private, he rehearsed a narrative of betrayal and posterity that insulated him further from the unfolding catastrophe above. Those around him lived under a strange mixture of devotion and fear, carrying out orders with a mechanical precision that masked the moral collapse at the center of power. The chasm between the bunker and the city above represented the final rupture of a regime that could not reconcile its ideology with reality. As the Red Army tightened the ring around central Berlin civilian life, disintegrated into survival rhythms and desperate choices, people burned what they could for heat and bartered for scraps of food while listening to distant artillery like an ongoing storm, reports of violence, looting, and mass displacement multiplied as law enforcement and civil services collapsed under pressure. Refugee streams flowed through the city in all directions as families attempted to flee the fighting, often into more danger than the areas they left. Those who remained experienced a different kind of violence, one rooted in scarcity, fear, and the breakdown of social norms that had once held communities together. The military command on both sides recognized the symbolic weight of landmarks, and the Reichstag became an obsession for Soviet political officers seeking a clear end to the narrative. Storming that edifice involved coordinated assaults with sappers, flamethrowers, and infantry committed to clearing every room and corridor. The propaganda value of planting a flag overshadowed the human carnage required to achieve that staged moment. When the dust settled and the photograph of the raised banner circulated, it simplified a complex reality into a single, enduring image. That image masked the thousands of individual tragedies happening simultaneously across every shattered street of the capital. As the Reichstag fell, the broader German military structure dissolved into negotiated surrenders and fragmented resistance pockets across the city. Communication failures, missing orders, and local commanders making desperate decisions led to uneven fighting and sporadic ceasefires. Some units fought on out of loyalty or ideology while others surrendered pragmatically to save lives and preserve buildings. This fragmentation meant that victory had no single heroic moment, but rather a series of local endings stitched together by exhaustion and practicality. The way Berlin fell was therefore less a triumphant march, and more a series of weary capitulations and bloody last stands. Inside the bunker, Hitler made his final irreversible decision as the city above dissolved into conquest and chaos. He married Eva Braun in a small ceremony and then dictated final political testament that reflected paranoia and rejection of accountability. His suicide was sudden but carried out in a theatrical context that matched the extremity of his life and regime. The news of his death did not immediately stop the fighting, but it removed the last centralized figure who might have ordered continued resistance for ideological reasons. Without him, there was nothing left to rally around, and the capture of remaining pockets became a matter of logistics and enforcement rather than dramatic policy choices. Hitler's suicide closed a grim chapter, but it did not erase the human toll that the battle had already inflicted across Berlin. Estimates of casualties vary, but the scale of death, injury, and displacement was enormous by any measure. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to skeletons of buildings, where lives had once been lived in ordinary patterns of work and love. The moral aftermath included not only the immediate physical destruction, but also the long shadow of trauma that survivors carried for decades. Families were broken, children orphaned, and a generation of Berliners confronted a complex mixture of guilt, victimhood, and survival that history would debate for years. When the final orders were given to cease organized resistance, the city still smoldered under occupation and lawlessness for weeks. Soviet soldiers occupied streets, set up checkpoints, and began the complex work of securing a devastated urban environment. The occupation era that followed involved food distribution, detainment of suspected war criminals, and the staging of immediate reconstruction efforts under harsh conditions. This period was characterized by a mixture of relief and harshness, with many civilians viewing liberators as both saviors and sources of further trauma. The political settlement that emerged would determine how Berlin and Germany would be administered in the immediate aftermath of the war. The fall of Berlin accelerated the end of the war in Europe, but it also marked the beginning of a new geopolitical order. Soviet control of the city and surrounding territories laid the groundwork for post-war divisions that would harden into the Cold War. The physical conquest translated into political leverage that Moscow used in shaping the future of Eastern Europe and Germany itself. Meanwhile, Western allies negotiated boundaries, reparations, and occupation zones that reflected both strategic interests and the moral urgency to prevent future aggression. The death of Hitler removed an individual tyrant, but did not immediately resolve systemic issues that had produced catastrophe. For survivors, the immediate concerns were shelter, food, and the daunting task of burying the dead amidst rubble and winter cold. Many refugees attempted to return to pre-war homes only to find landscapes and communities erased by bombs and bullets. The social fabric of Berlin required reconstruction not only of buildings but of trust, hygiene systems, and governance frameworks that had all collapsed. The psychological scars of the battle were subtle and pervasive, manifesting in displaced identities and a fractured sense of civic life. Reconstruction was therefore an act of civic therapy, as much as it was an exercise in brick and mortar. The international reaction to Berlin's fall was immediate and varied, and leaders balanced vindication with pragmatic planning. Allied statements celebrated the end of Nazi tyranny while also grappling with the complexities of administering a defeated Germany. The image of Soviet flags over Berlin became a contested symbol in diplomatic conversations and in the public imagination of victors and victims alike. This contested symbolism meant that memory of the battle would be shaped through politics, education, and the arts in ways that sometimes obscured individual suffering. How nations remembered Berlin became part of the broader effort to explain and redefine the war for future generations. The fall of the Reichstag and the suicide of Hitler created a potent narrative that many nations used to make sense of the war's end. For some, the narrative simplified a complex tragedy into a moral victory of good over evil. For others, this simplification obscured the messy realities of occupation, revenge, and the long work of reconciliation that followed. War narratives are often driven by emblematic moments, and Berlin provided many such moments that shaped decades of history and historiography. Remembering the battle, therefore, requires attention to both the iconic photographs and the countless small losses that photographs cannot convey. Ethical questions about retribution, justice, and responsibility surface quickly amid the ruins and legal aftermath of the conflict. War crimes, tribunals, and denazification efforts attempted to address criminal acts and systemic guilt across institutions. These processes were imperfect and politically charged, but they aimed to establish a foundation for rebuilding a lawful society. At the same time, many ordinary perpetrators slipped through initial purges while some victims received inadequate recognition or assistance. The messy human administrative effort that followed wartime collapse is an important reminder about the limits of legal answers in addressing moral catastrophe. The physical ruins of Berlin became a canvas for ideological rebuilding and memory politics in the decades that followed. East and West Berlin told different stories about the same streets depending on political interests and narratives of victimhood or liberation. Monuments, museums, and urban renewal projects shaped collective memory in ways that reflected contemporary needs and historical interpretations. Walking through modern Berlin is therefore walking through layers of story, where the scars of 1945 are incorporated into new civic meanings. The city became an ongoing project of remembering and forgetting, a place where history and modern life engage in a continuous conversation. The human cost of the Battle of Berlin cannot be reduced to statistics without losing something essential about the tragedy. Numbers provide scale, but they do not capture the texture of nights spent deafened by artillery or the small mercies that kept people alive. Survivors describe the battle in terms of moments and relationships that escape official counts and historical summaries. Those personal testimonies create an indispensable empathy that informs our understanding of what total war does to ordinary lives. Listening to survivors complicates heroic narratives and invites a more nuanced moral response to the past. Militarily, the battle demonstrated the horrors and efficiencies of late-stage total war, where strategic aims and symbolic targets merge into catastrophic urban combat. Soviet operational choices prioritized speed and finality, while German choices prioritized honorific gestures that meant little once logistics failed. The clash between political symbolism and military realities defined the fight for the city down to its last hours. This tactical and ethical collision reminds us that wars end on multiple planes, not simply when flags are planted or leaders die. The fall of Berlin was therefore an event of military consequence and a moral turning point that shaped how nations thought about power and responsibility afterward. In the end, the Battle of Berlin was a violent punctuation mark on a conflict that had consumed Europe for 6 devastating years. It closed one chapter but opened many more in geopolitics, memory, and human recovery. The drama of the final days is seared into global consciousness and continues to teach us about the risks of absolute power and national ruin. If this history matters to you, then it matters because people then were people now, and their last choices echo into our present. If this gave you a new perspective on the end of World War II, hit subscribe for more historical narratives and reflections.